Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Natalie Bray, and I'm the Director of Clerks and Planning Services for the City of Elliot Lake. With me this evening is John McDonald, our Election Coordinator, and Amanda Lawrence, Deputy Clerk. This information session is hosted in partnership between the City of Elliot Lake and the town of Blind River. Attending this evening from Blind River is Katie Scott, the CAO and Clerk. Thank you to all in attendance for your interest in the 2022 municipal election process. Please keep your microphones muted and cameras turned off at this time. The meeting invitation sent out this morning had information about logistics of the session, in particular the question period. A question period will take place after Mr. Dean gives his presentation. If you wish to ask a question during the question period, please use the raise hand feature and I'll call your display name, which at that time you may unmute your microphone and turn on your camera if you wish to ask your question. Once your question has been asked and answered, please remute and turn off your camera. If you prefer, you can email your question to the city's Deputy Clerk, Amanda Lawrence, or for those attending from Blind River to Pam Walsh, and your question will be forwarded to Mr. Dean to be answered. Just a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the city's website after the April 9th session. Now to introduce our presenter, Fred Dean is a lawyer who acts exclusively for municipalities across Ontario and municipal associations. He works with elected officials and senior staff, giving them tools to make effective decisions on behalf of their communities. He has been one of the facilitators, training members of council and heads of council on behalf of the Association of Municipalities since 2002. And now I'll hand it over to Mr. Dean.
Thanks, Natalie. Let's see if I can share the screen here. It says that you have disabled it.
So Amanda may have to click on the share screen button.
There we go. Well, good evening, and thank you, Natalie, for the opportunity to be here and to spend the next couple of hours talking about life on municipal council and some of the issues that I think you need to take into account before you decide to put your name forward. And congratulate you for even giving thought to running. It's a huge undertaking. It's significant. It has a tremendous impact on your community. I think it's pretty special. And I think the people that get involved with it devote a great deal of their time and energy wanting to give back to their respective communities. So you've covered the introduction. Let's just keep moving along. Here's what I want to cover in the next short while. I want to do a 101 course for municipal government, which can take me in the normal course of things anywhere from a day to 5 days, depending on the audience. And I'm going to try and do it in about 7 minutes tonight. But I want to give you an overview of some of the basics around local government in Ontario. And then I want to talk about municipal powers, because I think it's important to understand who has responsibility, who has power within the organization, and how it gets exercised and used. Accountability and transparency are words that you hear pretty regularly. And some people will say it's the least accountable and transparent level of government. And I think we can demonstrate pretty quickly that it is in fact the most accountable and most transparent level of government. I'm going to spend some time on who's responsible for doing what. This is an area that I think it becomes really significant and really important as we get closer to a new council. The magic date, by the way, in terms of filing papers is May 2nd. So we're a little bit out from that yet, but that's the day that nominations open and people will be able to apply. I'm going to talk about some personal considerations, things you should take into account if you're deciding to run, and then some personal responsibilities under the Code of Conduct, conflict of interest. And I'm going to touch upon confidentiality as well, because I think it's kind of a fairly significant part of what members of council are responsible for. I'm not going to do the exercise tonight. I do this if it's an in-person session, but it's one I've been doing for a long time, and I encourage you to do this. Take a piece of paper and sit and watch TV or do whatever, and write out a list of the number of things local government does for your community. If you get to 75, that's pretty good. There are well over 100. And I think it's important to get a sense of the scope of what local government does. It impacts people within the community, businesses in the community in a way that I think no other level of government does. It's important to have a sense of what that's about. So I encourage you to take that on as a challenge and see how many that you can identify. I want to talk about municipal powers. Provinces have the jurisdiction under the British North America Act and now the Canada Act to be responsible for local government, municipalities. And that's true right across Canada. And it's true that all the powers that municipalities have come from the province. There's no inherent jurisdiction. Municipalities can't just do whatever they want to do. They have to be able to trace back the authority from a provincial statute or regulation that's in place. In 2001, the province rewrote, for the first time in 150 years, rewrote the Municipal Act. And it changed a lot of really significant aspects of it. Before 2001, municipalities were named based on their size. So there were villages and townships and towns and small cities and big cities. And the powers from the province were allocated depending on the size. The bigger you were, the more powers you, as a municipal organization, you received. That's all gone. And in 2001, the province changed the rule and said there are only 3 kinds of municipalities in Ontario. Single tier, that's you. And that, in fact, is all of Northern Ontario. And there's some single tier municipalities in the south, Ottawa and Kingston and Prince Edward County and a number of them, and they are all single tier. And here's the thing about that. The province has a bundle of powers that it gives to municipalities, and it gives to the single tier municipalities all of the powers. So that Blind River and Elliot Lake have the same powers as, for example, the City of Ottawa. That wasn't the case pre-2001. In the south, there are 2 kinds of municipalities. One is upper tier, and that's a county or a region or a district, and lower tier, and that's the towns and cities and townships within that particular county or region. And in those situations, the powers are divvied up between the upper tier and the lower tier. So in Northern Ontario, municipalities have all of that power given to municipalities, no matter what your size. Section 5 of the Act, Municipal Act, came into effect again in 2001. It was brand new. And it is, I think, one of the most important sections in the entire Act. It's pretty simple and very short. And it says this, that powers of a municipality shall be exercised by council and shall be exercised by way of bylaw. So all powers of municipality shall, and when you see the word shall, that's mandatory, all powers shall be exercised by council, not by members of council, but by council. and they will be exercised by bylaw. So let's see how that plays out. This complex and technical and multifaceted set of jurisdictions and activities that municipalities take on. Well, to exercise power, it must be done at what I call a duly constituted meeting. And there are a number of elements that go into a duly constituted meeting. Firstly, municipality has to tell the public that it's holding a meeting. And that you will find on the website, and the clerk has the responsibility to put it up there. And it's notice not just of regular council meetings, but also special council meetings. It's notice for all your committees. It's notice of open meetings and closed meetings. The public is entitled to know when various parts of the municipality are meeting and deliberating. That's part of the transparency. That's part of being open to the public. The second part of the test in terms of exercising power is the meetings must be open to the public. Municipalities cannot exercise power at closed meetings. Bylaws can only be passed at a public meeting. There has to be a quorum present. I'm kind of digitally challenged, so I always create my councils of 5 people because it's simple. So a quorum of 5 is 3. It's a majority of the members. So if all 5 members are there, that's a quorum. A meeting can be held. If 3 members are there virtually or in person, a meeting can be held. So that's the next element. The quorum must be present. The next part is things carried by way of a majority vote. So if all 5 are present, 3 must have voted in favor of it in order to pass it. If only 3 members are present, we know that's a quorum, meetings allowed. How many have to vote in favor? Well, 2, which is interesting because 2 is less than a majority of the entire council. But in that circumstance, the act allows those 2 to act on behalf of the corporation. The last principle in the exercise of powers is that all members vote, and that includes the head of council. They have a vote on council, makes them a unique in terms of chairing meetings. It's a very different approach than it is for a Lions Club or some other organization where the chair tends not to vote. But this is part of the act, and that all members are entitled to vote and must vote, in fact, on a recorded vote. I talked at the beginning about accountable and transparent government, and municipalities really are. And let me just give you a couple of examples of how that plays out. I said that all meetings are open where power is being exercised. If council or a committee of council is going into a closed meeting, there are 3 basic things that must happen. Firstly, it may only go into the closed meeting for one of the items that's listed in the Municipal Act. And there, in section 239, there are a number of subject matters that allow for closed meetings. If there's going to be a closed meeting, there must be a resolution passed at a public meeting. So before going into the closed meeting, there has to be a resolution passed indicating that there is a closed meeting and what the general nature of the matter or matters to be deliberated at that meeting. The third part is what can be done at closed meetings, and there are restrictions in the legislation in terms of what councils or committees can do while in a closed meeting. So again, it's this accountability and this transparency, the ability for the public at least to know that the closed meeting is being held and what the subject matter is. The other way of demonstrating accountable and transparent is the number of policies that have to be in place. These are council policies. They're adopted by bylaw. And you can see the list there. It's not a complete list, but pretty close. There are a couple of them I just wanted to point out. There is a policy in your municipality called the Accountability and Transparency Policy. And I think if you're running for council, that's a policy you should have a look at, because it indicates how your municipality is attempting to ensure that it is both accountable and transparent. And that's useful information to have. The other policy, the last two on this list are relatively recent. The council member staff policy is new, and it requires that there be terms set out in terms of what is appropriate between individual members of council and staff. It also will tie into the code of conduct for the municipality. So all of these policies have to be in place, and they're not intended as dust collectors. They're intended to be active, ongoing, and will have to be amended and changed from time to time, but they are there, and they are a demonstration of accountable and transparent government. I get a chance to work with a lot of different municipalities around the province. And one of the issues often that comes up when a municipality is having some difficulty is the issue of who's responsible for doing what. Interestingly, the province has set what I call job descriptions for council, for the head of council, and for staff. And I think it's important to have a quick look. We're not going to spend a lot of time on these, but at least have a sense that the province has made some determinations as to what is appropriate in terms of the responsibilities of various people within the organization. So let's go through the list quickly. We'll start with council. Council's like a board of directors of the corporation. Municipalities are corporations, by the way. And so council exercises corporate powers, and we saw that power section in section 5 of the Act earlier. The Act also says that the council represents the public. No surprise there. The public want to bring their position forward to council, and council is expected to identify and act in the best interest of the municipality, identifying the public interests. The next provision is that council must consider the well-being and interests of the municipality. And in this circumstance, municipality has two meanings. It means the geographical area of the municipality. So council's acting in the best interest of that geographical area, but it also means the municipal corporation. And so members and the council has an obligation to consider the well-being and interests of the municipal corporation itself. Council members cannot, either under this legislation or in fact under the insurance policy the municipality carries, cannot act against the interests of the municipal corporation. As I said earlier, municipal councils act collectively, they act publicly, and they do it with notice. They tell the public in advance. And notice includes the agenda, and the agenda includes the backup material, all the reports that are coming from staff to go. That's effective notice, and that's what should be given to the public when a meeting is put together and the agenda is put forward and the reports are prepared. Here's the key thing. There is no management role for council or members of council. The province has, I think, created a very clear line between the responsibilities of staff, the administration, and the responsibilities of the elected council, which at the end of the day, the responsibility is to set policy and make decisions. But there is no management role for council or for individual members of council. And that line is a really clear one, and I think it's important. There are limited individual powers that go to individual members of council. The powers rest with this collective body called council, and that's where the power resides. In terms of head of council, this up until 2001, the Municipal Act referred to mayors and reeves and wardens and chairs. depending on the size of the municipality and the type of municipality. So reeves generally were townships. Mayors were towns and cities, and the warden is the head of the county council in Southern Ontario and the chair of the regional councils in Southern Ontario. The act was changed, and it only now refers to head of council. And the powers and the duties of the head of council, no matter what type of municipality it is and what the council decides to refer to its head of council as, it's referred to throughout the act as head of council. A number of municipalities, about a decade ago now, particularly in Renfrew County, all of the townships had reeves. That was pretty common throughout the province for townships. Renfrew County decided that they would change the title of head of council to mayor, because they believed that mayor had a greater meaning to the public generally, not only locally, but internationally as well. Heads of council preside over council meetings. And in fact, the act goes on to say that they must be chaired efficiently and effectively. That's a pretty high standard. That standard was increased. So heads of council, I think, need some training in terms of how to be effective. It is very different sitting in the chair of the mayor than it is a councillor. It's a very different role, very different responsibility. The mayor has an obligation, or the head of council, to provide leadership to council. Notice it says leadership to council, not to the organization. And we'll see why that's important in a few moments when we talk about the CAO. The head of council speaks on behalf of the municipality. And this is an important one. It's not a power that's given to other members of council. How does the mayor know what to speak on behalf of council? Well, it's the motions or the resolutions that are passed by council. The mayor has an obligation to speak on behalf of the municipality with respect to the actions and decisions made by council. The mayor has some obligations. I'm not going to get into these, but it's part of that leadership role, providing information to council and make recommendations on things like administrative policies and accountability and transparency. Again, that's just all wrapped up within that leadership role. There's a term that's been really confusing over the years, and that is that the head of council acts as the chief executive officer, the CEO of the municipal corporation. And if you're from a business background, you'll know that the CEO is the person who's responsible for day-to-day management of the organization. In a business context, that's true. In a municipal context, that's not what it means. And so a few years ago, the province decided to define and spell out what it means to be a CEO in a municipal context. And that's set out in the Act. And if you read the various sections, there's half a dozen or so, it basically provides that the head of council is the champion of the municipality. There are no day-to-day management duties in that section. And the reason for that is that in the province has created and allowed the creation of the position of Chief Administrative Officer, CAO. That's who has the day-to-day responsibility for the administration of the staff within the organization. This is an interesting section, and I think it's really well written. Municipal staff have an obligation to undertake research and provide advice to council. Well, what does that mean? Well, very simply, it means those are the reports that staff write to council, and they're written after research is done, and they provide advice. And to me, that means they make a recommendation. My view of the world is staff should always make a recommendation to council, and it should be by way of the motion that council is being asked to consider. So that bullet point says that staff is the primary resource of information and background for members of council. We'll see other areas, staff or council gets information, but the primary source is the staff's research and providing advice directly to council. Once council makes a decision, then it's up to staff to implement that decision. Whether that was the recommendation of staff or not, staff have an obligation to implement council's decision. And again, this really spells out clearly that council's role is to make decisions and to set policy, and staff is there to implement it. The third bullet point talks about administrative practices and procedures to carry out council's decisions. Every department in every municipality has a procedural guide or set of procedural rules. It's how the department works. These aren't for council. These are strictly administrative to be dealt with to allow the staff to function effectively within the sphere that they're functioning in. This quote I've used in presentations for a long time. Probably I've debated every time whether to take it out, but I love the image. And that is, council should steer the boat rather than row it. And I think that's a good analogy. It's from a book from Osborne and Gabler. This is way back into the 1970s, I think, called Reinventing Government. And it says that council should decide what services and programs and leave the staff to decide how to deliver those services. It's again, a clear line that is defined not only in that book, but in the Municipal Act itself. So the question becomes, how does council make decisions? Well, we know they have to be made at public meetings. We know that there has to be a majority vote in favor in order to pass it. But how does council make those decisions? Well, it gets advice from staff, and we know that's the primary resource for council. But there are other sources as well, and one is the committee structure. And virtually every municipality in the province has a different committee structure. They vary, and to all the way from, I've dealt with one municipality recently, didn't have any committees at all. I've dealt with others that have committees and subcommittees, and they're overburdened with the amount of time that their council members are spending at committee meetings. But the intention of having committees, the purpose that council creates committees for, is to provide advice and to make recommendations to council. That's the purpose of a committee. It is background information. It's the opportunity to look at an issue in more depth and to make recommendations to council. So committee structures can vary. They have some basic principles, but fundamentally they're different in different parts of the province, different municipalities. Council also gets advice from the public. And that can certainly happen in a number of different ways. If it's happening at a council meeting, then it should be by way of a delegation. The public has no inherent right to speak at a council meeting unless they're authorized to do so. And you would look for that within the procedure bylaw. Council will have a process for delegations, and that's how council will receive advice from members of the public, from the delegations. Members of council receive advice from the public outside of council in a whole bunch of different ways, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. There are entities in local government in Ontario called local boards. And local boards are each have a different relationship with the municipality. Let me give you an example. The library, if municipalities want to have a library within their community, council cannot create it themselves or itself. It must create a public library board. And that board will be a separate entity. will have a linking relationship with council and will administer and govern the issues relating to the library itself. So there's this restriction on councils not able to run the library without creating a local board. There are other local boards. Across Northern Ontario, there are DSABs, health units, police services board. There are a number of different ones that are there, and each of them is a separate entity, and each of them has a different working relationship with the municipality, including how they are funded. Conservation authorities, another example. One of the realities of municipal governance in my mind is the number of meetings that members of council have to attend. I think it's fair to say that if you're going to run for council, you better love meetings, because sometimes people have the view that, you know, being on council is a couple of meetings a month and that's about all there is to it, and then you get the big paycheck. Well, nothing could be farther from the truth. Firstly, the paycheck isn't very big unless you're in the GTA in the Toronto area, where it is significant. And it's basically a full-time job for those people. And most of them are earning six figures. So it's a very different world when you get outside that realm of Toronto. There are a lot of meetings that occur, not just council meetings, regular and special, but there are committee meetings of various sorts. Members will be on local boards. They may be on different groups within the community. Members of council need to love going to meetings and need to be good at it. And there are some skills that can be developed around meetings and how you conduct yourself in order to achieve the result that you're looking for at the end of the day. One of the significant documents in every municipality is the procedure bylaw. And I know it sounds overwhelmingly boring and uninteresting, but it's anything but that. And I think the procedure bylaw is one of the two most important documents in the municipality. The other one being the annual budget, which sets your policies, priorities for the year ahead. But the procedure bylaw sets the rules for meetings. It sets the governance model, the types of committees. It defines relationships between councillors and the mayor, between members of council and staff, and members of council and the public. It's a really significant and important document. Every municipality needs to review it from time to time. Most of them I've done about 8 this year, I think, with different municipalities, and it needs to reflect your community and your operation, but there are some basic principles in it. Interestingly, if I get called to a municipality where there's some difficulties, I can often identify them in terms of the meeting problems just by reading the procedure bylaw. They have built into them some circumstances that will create problems for themselves, and they really don't appreciate that they're there. So, but if you're thinking of running for council, I urge you to take a look at your municipality's procedure bylaw. How will your life change the day you're elected? Significantly. The first day or so, you'll be convinced that everybody loves you and that you're on cloud 9, and that won't last. What the reality is, people will expect that they can reach out to you at virtually any time of the day or week. They will speak to you differently. People that are your friends will speak to you differently. People you see on the street will speak to you differently. And your family will, to some extent, treat you differently based on having been elected to council. it's something that I think is really important to discuss. Once you are elected, it's a 4-year term and you are on 24/7 for 4 years. There's no question about that. The expectation people have of you is that you are available and you're going to be there to help them out. It requires, as it says, a total commitment. And the council members I've worked with over the years, that's been entirely true. They are totally committed to the job, and it just becomes part of the nature of the municipal office. I've had conversations with people that have left local government, both members of council and staff, and it's always consistent. They, after a few months away, saying, I had no idea how wrapped up I was in the local politics and what was going on day to day and the issues. It really does consume people. I tell a story. I'm not sure. Let me tell you the story. It's an interesting one. This is about 10 years ago, 2 or 3 elections ago, at a similar type situation where a former mayor in Eastern Ontario told the story, and it went something like this. He said, I ran for mayor. He'd been on council. He was a councillor. He said, I ran for mayor. And the election results came in and I won. And he said, I was pretty excited. And I went home that night and I said to my wife, I won. I'm the mayor, and I'm going to not only be the mayor of our town, but I'm going to be on county council, because mayors go to the upper tier government. And he was pretty happy and elated about it, and really walking 2 feet off the floor. And he said that to his son, and he said to his son, I won. And his son said, and looked at him and he said, I guess I lost. And he meant by that there wasn't going to be much time, because he was now at 2 levels of government, not 1. And this being on council was taking up a lot of time that the son was missing him. You need to take that into consideration. It's a significant factor that you need to find time for the family. It's really important to do, not only significant others, but also kids, children. So have a conversation with your significant other and with your children, because it's going to affect them. It will. The old theory was that you had to help people understand how to answer telephone calls in the house. I don't know many people that have a house phone anymore. Everybody seems to have a cell phone, but it's important to make sure that the 10-year-old or the 12-year-old picks up the telephone and there's an irate payer on the other end, that child knows how to deal with that person. It's really significant, and it can be very, very difficult. The other thing that can happen, I'm sure none of you will remember this, but this was a big issue back in the 90s in Sudbury. Sudbury was the only large municipality in all of Ontario that had a store hours bylaw. And it allowed stores to be open certain hours a week and must be closed other hours. Every other municipality was wide open. One of the members of council came to me and said, I want to expand the store hours by 2 hours. I want to give the public 2 more hours a week to shop. And we had a conversation, and I said, I think that's a really bad idea. You'd be better off getting rid of the entire bylaw, because there's going to be some backlash. And he said, no, there won't. So I prepared the bylaw, did the report to council. Council approved the extension of the 2 hours, 2 more hours a week that stores could be open. Not had to be, but could. The pushback from the business community and the employees in retail was astounding. Members of council could not go into a store without being questioned and abused by the store people. And that maybe wasn't surprising. What was surprising was all of their spouses faced the exact same harassment, if you will, from the store owners. It was a really difficult time. The counselor finally did come back and said, we should have gotten rid of it. When I left Sudbury, it was still in place. I'm sure they've gotten rid of it by now, but just it's fascinating. The other thing I think is going to be social media and how that gets dealt with, and how your kids are going to react when they see your name on social media. I think a lot of the election this time around is going to be on social media, the campaigning, and then we're going to see a lot more of that than we ever had before. Expect, if you are a member of council, that people are going to stop you and talk to you, whether you're at the grocery store or out for a walk, getting gas, doesn't matter. And the smaller community, the more that is true. I live in Toronto now, and frankly, I could walk down the street and walk past my counselor and I wouldn't recognize him. I have no idea what he looks like. I sort of know, but I'm not really sure. But that's not true in small communities. Everybody knows you. They know who you are. Another thing that can impact your family time, and in a really significant way, is the amount of reading you have to do. You better love to read. I said before, you better love meetings. Well, you better love to read. Agendas are getting more substantial in a number of communities, and this constant wave of material, both for council meetings, committee meetings, local boards, whatever. And the expectation is that you will read it all for two reasons. One is you need to be prepared for the meeting, so you need to understand what's in the package. But secondly, you need to be aware if there are any conflicts of interest with any of the material that's there. So prep time takes a lot of time, and reading takes a lot of time. You need to divvy out a portion of your week to set aside just to read through the materials that are coming at you. And it's relentless. It never ends. It's always there. So to be ready for the meetings, you need to put the prep time into it. It's important to do. Let me just cover off where I'm going with the rest of this. I talked about micromanaging. I didn't call it that, but micromanaging is a situation where a member of council is attempting to direct staff to do work. Firstly, there's no authority for it, but more importantly, it can have a really negative impact on your organization. If a member of council is attempting to direct work and having employees do certain things, the best situation for that is that the employees need to have a system whereby the CAO learns of that situation and puts a stop to it. It's not appropriate. It's outside the scope of the duties of a member of council, and it can cause really significant problems within the organization. I've seen it. Incivility in some communities has been an issue. In others, it hasn't been an issue at all. There's lots of training that is now happening around that. I'm going to talk about confidentiality in a few minutes. Just a couple of things I think to keep in mind when you do that. And then we'll touch on three aspects of personal responsibility, three examples. Codes of conduct, integrity commissioners, conflict of interest, and I want to talk about water just for a minute, because I think we need to get a sense of the seriousness of the responsibility of members of council. Interestingly, there is currently a bill before Queen's Park, and I'm not sure what the status of it is. I haven't looked. I know it's had at least first reading. It's Bill 10, and it's called the Stopping Harassment and Abuse by Local Leaders Act 2022. And it will allow council to direct the integrity commissioner to apply to court to have a member removed from council. This is a pretty dramatic change. We'll see if it gets through the legislature. It's going to have to go through pretty quickly before the end of the session, but it's there now, and it's had at least one reading at this point. With respect to codes of conduct, up until not too many years ago, codes of conduct were discretionary. There were a few of them around the province. Integrity commissioners could be appointed, and their responsibility was to investigate and report to council. That changed a couple of years ago, and codes of conduct are now mandatory. And there are provisions in a regulation under the Municipal Act that sets out what, at a minimum, are the subject matters that must be covered in the code. My advice has always been to municipalities to create a code that covers those 5 items and don't go any farther. There's not really any need to, but they're now mandatory. The role of the integrity commissioner has been expanded. Not only it continues to investigate and to report to council, but also has an obligation to educate not only council but the public. And the Act created a new concept that allowed members of council to request an opinion from an integrity commissioner. And that opinion, the request had to be made in writing, and the expectation is the response would be in writing. That was a very different approach, and it's one that's there for not only the code, but for conflict of interest. And in terms of conflict of interest, generally members were going to their own lawyer to get advice. Oh, that's one of the things I should mention. Let's move on to conflict of interest. The courts have been clear that members may not ask staff for specific advice on the Conflict of Interest Act. Staff's role and responsibility is to the corporation, not to individual members of council. And this act came into effect in 1972 and created a personal obligation on members. It doesn't apply to staff, it's just members' personal obligation. Didn't see a lot of changes in the legislation until just relatively recently, where there's some changes that have been put in that will make a difference. And I'll talk a bit about those as well, but let me just go through some of the fundamentals. It talks about pecuniary interest, and pecuniary means financial. And that interest can be direct. So if I have Fred's widget shop on Main Street and I'm putting in a bid for widgets with the municipality and council's considering it, at the meeting, I would make a declaration saying, Your Worship, I'm declaring a pecuniary interest on item 4 because I own Fred's widget shop. That's a direct pecuniary interest. The Act goes on and talks about a number of indirect pecuniary interests, and these can involve family, they can involve employees, they can involve associations. It's a pretty broad scope, and it's important, I think, that members become familiar with the extent of that interest that they may have. And they need, I think, to be trained on this relatively early in the term, and also do their own research. There's a book available from Municipal World. If you just Google Municipal World, you'll find they have a whole library of books, and one of them is called Ontario Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. It's a book that I recommend every member of council have a copy of. It explains the act, it breaks it down, and is very helpful in terms of giving you an understanding of what some of the concepts are within the Act itself. Historically, since 1972, members who have a pecuniary interest have to declare it at the beginning of the council meeting. And so it gets recorded in the minutes. The Act's now been changed to add to that, in addition to the verbal declaration, the member must file in writing the declaration as well. And my advice is to make sure those are the same, they're identical. The clerk has an obligation to take both the minutes, that portion of the minutes of the meeting, and the written declaration and put them in a registry. So anybody can go and look at the times that a given member declared a pecuniary interest. So in addition to declaring, there's an obligation on members who have a pecuniary interest to not participate in the discussion, in the debate, to not vote on it, and to not influence. And the courts have said influence is not just at the meeting or just before, it's any time before, during, or after the meeting. So it's pretty broad. Influence has been changed as well to make it clear that influence also means influencing staff, not just other members of council, but staff as well. So that's now been put in place. And it's a much broader scope than it used to be. Originally, this act contemplated that if a person, a ratepayer within the community, had a belief that a member had a pecuniary interest and didn't declare it, they had to bring a court action, and the cost was borne by them. That's changed, and now the complaint can be made to the integrity commissioner, who will advise council. And the integrity commissioner may also apply to court. And the court has the power to remove a member from council. And there are lesser penalties as well, but also keep a member of council off of council for up to 7 years. The elector can still bring the application to court directly if they wish to do so. Who can bring the application has been expanded. It's broader now than just electors within your community. And what we're seeing around the provinces, not surprisingly, the number of complaints is up. And it's expensive. Costs are being, of all of this is borne by the municipality. So there's a significant impact, if you will, in terms of these applications. That's why, as I said before, when you get the agendas and the materials, it's imperative that you read it all, because buried in there could be potentially a pecuniary interest. And the expectation is that you will have read it, be prepared, and make the declaration in accordance with the Act. I wanted to mention confidentiality quickly, because I think it's an important area. Members of council carry around with them a lot of confidential information in their head, sometimes on paper, sometimes in their electronically, but they have an obligation to maintain the confidentiality of the material, the documents that are confidential to the municipality itself. And it can be written, it can be verbal, as it says. One of the items that must be covered off in the councillor's code of conduct is the issue dealing with confidentiality. But over and above the code, I mean, this years ago, there was almost a member of council in Sudbury who was sued by the municipality for breaching confidentiality, and it ended up in a significant lawsuit. And most members were not very happy with this member who breached the confidentiality. So it's in the code, but it's also, I think it's something you need to be prepared and be cautious about. So you need to be cautious talking to people. I put the coffee shop, I'm not sure anybody goes to the coffee shop, but what's on the coffee shop, what's up on the internet. You need to be cautious around talking to family, and you have an obligation not to share with family members as well. Keep in mind also that members of council, other than the mayor, do not speak for the municipality. It's imperative that you make that clear anytime that you are speaking to someone about this. I want to talk about the Safe Drinking Water Act just very quickly, because this is another example of duties and responsibilities and liabilities that come to members of council. We all remember Walkerton, and the response to Walkerton by the province was to pass a statute called the Safe Drinking Water Act 2002. And I have to tell you, at the time, that was the leading piece of legislation, I'm told, in the world. It was the most comprehensive water protection act anywhere. And it was passed, except for a section that imposed personal liability on decision makers. And so, frankly, we didn't pay much attention until the summer of 2012, 10 years later. And the province announced that that section was coming into effect in January 2013. And it says that there is personal liability on decision makers. Who are decision makers? Well, we know that's members of council, but it's also senior staff, and it's your water operator. There is personal liability on decision makers for the responsibility of maintaining a potable water system. It says very basically that there's a need for detailed training. The responsibility for different members of council can be different depending on how they acted and what steps they've taken. And it means, I had a member of council say to me, well, how would I know how to protect the water system? That's why members of council need training, in detailed training on what it means to meet the requirements, the duty of care and the standard of care imposed by this legislation. I did some training on this act back in 2013, but ongoing from that, the Walkerton Clean Water Center, WCWC, offers a program, and they will come out to an area. They might do 1 or 2 municipalities together, and they offer, I think it's a 3-hour course. And at the end of that 3-hour course, there's an exam. And if you pass the exam, you get a certificate. And I have said to members of council from day one in January 13 that you need to put that away, and because it demonstrates that you have trained yourself, began to get some training on what it means to meet the standard of care. The penalties in that act are substantial, both against the corporation and against individuals. And it says that there is a great deal of responsibility in taking on this role as a member of council. And this is just one example of it. And frankly, when it comes to water safety, it's a matter of health and safety, and no one from the public is going to have any sympathy if the council and the people within the decision-making realm within the municipality haven't satisfied the requirements under the act. It's an important one. Okay, summing up. It's a lot of material in a short period of time. You need to understand the role, what you've been elected to do, what the act requires that you do. It's clear that municipal powers rest with council, and they must be exercised at a public meeting, and they powers are exercised by bylaw of council. Council members are not managers, they're not micromanagers. They are decision makers and policy setters, and they have people provide them information to allow them to make effective decisions. I encourage you, if you're thinking of running, to talk to your family. It's a commitment that involves not just you as personally, but it involves them as well. And you need to have a bit of a sense of what this is about. So congratulations, whether you decide to run or not. congratulations even thinking about it. It's a big step, giving back to your community. It takes a lot of time and a lot of commitment. And as I said before, it will consume you. It's a really, really fascinating place to be. I've been in local government for a long time at various levels and various organizations, and there's nothing better, but it really is a world that's very different to what we normally operate in. There's a lot of different aspects coming at you all the time. The other thing, just one last comment, in terms of staff, in my experience, are there to help members of council. If you're looking to achieve something, you should be talking to staff in advance as to how you can achieve it, or whether it is even achievable. And staff are there to help you. If you're new, you need help around the procedure at the meetings, look to the clerk. If you have issues around policy and whatnot, talk to the CAO and move from there with respect to all the various aspects. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up, and we can see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dean, for your presentation. Perhaps